On a quiet Christmas Eve morning in 2002, a young woman disappeared from her California home. At first, it seemed like a straightforward missing persons case. A pregnant wife vanishes while walking her dog. Her husband reports her missing. The community rallies to search. But as investigators dug deeper into the timeline of that fateful day, something didn't add up. Small inconsistencies began to emerge. The story started to crack. And what looked like an ordinary disappearance transformed into one of the most infamous murder investigations in American history. Laci Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant when she went missing from her Modesto home. Her husband, Scott Peterson, told police he last saw her around 9:30 that morning. She was watching a cooking show about meringue, planning to mop the floor and bake cookies. He said she intended to walk their golden retriever to a nearby park. Scott claimed he left for a solo fishing trip to the Berkeley Marina, almost 90 miles away. When he returned that evening, Laci was gone. The initial investigation focused on finding Laci alive. Volunteers distributed flyers. Search teams combed the neighborhood. Scott appeared at vigils and gave interviews. To the public, he seemed like a concerned husband desperately seeking his missing wife. But investigators were quietly documenting something else. They were building a timeline, and that timeline was about to expose a web of deception. The first crack appeared almost immediately. A neighbor named Karen Service found the Peterson family dog wandering alone with a muddy leash at 10:18 that morning. She returned the dog to their backyard. This single observation became critical. If Laci left to walk the dog around 9:30, as Scott claimed, why was the dog found loose less than an hour later? Another neighbor saw the same dog around 10:45. No one reported seeing Laci at all that morning. Scott's fishing story raised questions too. He purchased a small aluminum boat just weeks before Laci disappeared. His own family didn't know he owned it. He drove 90 miles to fish in San Francisco Bay on Christmas Eve, a strange choice for someone whose pregnant wife was about to give birth. He brought no fishing gear that would suggest a serious fishing trip. When police asked what he caught, his answers were vague and inconsistent. The pieces weren't fitting together. Then came the affair. 1 month after Laci vanished, a massage therapist named Amber Frey held a press conference. She revealed she'd been romantically involved with Scott Peterson. But here's what made it chilling. Scott told Amber he'd lost his wife and would be spending his first Christmas alone. He said this on December 9th, 2 weeks before Laci actually went missing. He'd already started telling people his wife was dead while she was still alive. Investigators recorded phone calls between Scott and Amber. The conversations revealed a pattern of lies. On New Year's Eve, while search teams were still looking for Laci, Scott called Amber from a vigil in Modesto. He told her he was in Paris celebrating near the Eiffel Tower. He fabricated entire trips and created an alternate reality. The deception was constant and calculated. The timeline problems multiplied. Scott told one neighbor he was going golfing that morning. He told police he went fishing. He couldn't keep his own story straight. Phone records showed he made calls from locations that contradicted his stated movements. His cell phone pinged towers that didn't match his supposed route. Every data point investigators checked revealed another discrepancy. A burglary occurred directly across the street from the Peterson home. For years, investigators believed it happened on December 26th, 2 days after Laci disappeared. But new evidence suggests it actually occurred on December 24th, the same day she went missing. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a van outside the burglarized home with 3 men loading items. One witness specifically saw them carrying a safe. The homeowner herself reported seeing a suspicious man on the block that morning before leaving town. If the burglary happened on the 24th, it would have been nearly impossible for it to occur on the 26th, when police and media had swarmed the street. This timeline shift opens a possibility the original investigation dismissed. Could Laci have encountered the burglars? By March 2003, police had reclassified the missing persons case as a homicide investigation. They had no body, no crime scene, no physical evidence of murder. But they had a timeline that didn't work, and timelines don't lie. On April 13, 2003, a fetus washed ashore on the San Francisco Bay near Point Isabel. The next day, the decomposed body of a woman was found nearby. Both bodies were discovered just miles from the Berkeley marina where Scott claimed he went fishing. DNA testing confirmed what investigators suspected. The bodies were Lacey and her unborn son Connor. Police arrested Scott Peterson near San Diego. He bleached his hair, grown a goatee, and was carrying $15,000 in cash along with his brother's identification. His appearance and behavior suggested someone preparing to flee. During the 10-hour drive back to Modesto, Scott barely spoke. He was charged with first-degree murder for Lacey's death and second-degree murder for Connor's death. The trial began in June 2004. Prosecutors built their case almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. They couldn't prove how, when, or where Scott killed Lacey, but they could prove his timeline was impossible. They demonstrated pattern after pattern of deception. They showed his affair, his lies, his bizarre behavior after Lacey vanished. They argued his motive was simple. He wanted freedom from marriage and fatherhood. Amber Frey testified for the prosecution. Jurors heard recordings of Scott's voice as he lied to her repeatedly. They heard him claim he was traveling across Europe while he was actually in Modesto attending search efforts for his missing wife. The recordings painted a portrait of a man living a double life, someone who viewed truth as optional. The defense argued the prosecution had no direct evidence. No witnesses saw Scott commit murder. No forensic evidence tied him to a specific crime. They suggested someone else could have killed Lacey. They pointed to the burglary across the street as a potential alternative explanation, but they couldn't explain away the timeline. They couldn't account for Scott's lies. They couldn't make his story coherent. On November 12, 2004, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty on both murder charges. The deliberations lasted just over a week. In December, the same jury recommended death by lethal injection. The judge followed their recommendation. Scott was sent to death row at San Quentin State Prison. But the story didn't end there. In 2020, California's Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence due to jury selection issues. He was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Then in January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced they were representing Scott Peterson. They claimed to have new evidence suggesting he might be innocent. The Innocence Project points to scientific advances in fetal development analysis. The prosecution argued Lacey died on December 23rd based on estimates of how developed Connor was when his body was found. But newer research methods suggest Connor may have died days later, between December 28th and January 5th, when Scott had an alibi. Even the prosecution's own expert admitted that using more recent scientific standards, he would have placed the date of death around January 2nd, not December 23rd. There's also the burglary timeline discrepancy. If that crime happened on December 24th while Scott was fishing, it creates reasonable doubt about what happened to Lacey. Several eyewitnesses reported seeing suspicious activity at the Medina home that morning. One allegedly heard the burglars discussing a woman confronting them. But investigators dismissed these accounts because they believed the burglary occurred 2 days later, when the timeline would have made such a crime nearly impossible with all the police presence. The case remains controversial. Some believe Scott Peterson is exactly where he belongs, a convicted murderer who killed his pregnant wife to escape his responsibilities. Others believe the justice system convicted him based on his character and behavior rather than solid evidence. They argue the timeline problems work both ways. If the original timeline was wrong, maybe Scott's story was actually true. What's undeniable is how the timeline became the skeleton key to this case. Without a smoking gun, without eyewitnesses, without a clear crime scene, investigators had to rely on reconstructing when things happened and where people were. Every phone call, every witness statement, every data point became a piece of a larger puzzle. And when those pieces didn't fit Scott Peterson's narrative, suspicion hardened into certainty. The Lacey Peterson case demonstrates how modern investigations work. Cell phone towers track movements. Computer logs show activity. Surveillance systems capture moments. Every action leaves a digital footprint. In 2002, this technology was relatively new to criminal investigations. Today, it's standard, and it's nearly impossible to fabricate a timeline that withstands forensic scrutiny. Scott Peterson remains in prison, still maintaining his innocence more than 20 years after Lacey disappeared. The Los Angeles Innocence Project continues to investigate. New hearings may re-examine evidence, The case may yet take another turn, but regardless of what happens next, the Lacey Peterson investigation changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases. It proved that in the absence of physical evidence, a detailed timeline could become the most powerful tool investigators possess, because time doesn't forget. Digital records don't change their stories, and when someone's account of events conflicts with the provable sequence of what actually happened, the truth has a way of emerging. What looked ordinary that Christmas Eve morning in Modesto turned out to be anything but. And the timeline that seemed straightforward at first became the evidence that convicted a man of murder, or possibly, according to some, the evidence that might one day set him free.